All right, on to the House. It voted today to rebuke President Trump's tariffs on Canada. 6 Republicans joined Democrats, passing a resolution to repeal those tariffs. It seeks to end the national emergency that the president declared to impose those tariffs. But the rare bipartisan vote against the White House agenda is largely symbolic. Actually, undoing the policy would require support from Trump himself. The resolution is now heading to the Senate.
Something impossible just happened, and Canada is the quiet winner. The Senate blocked Trump's move, giving Canada relief while putting limits on U.S. power. Allies broke ranks, and the impact could be bigger than it looks. But what pushed America to step back like this? The United States Senate passed a bipartisan resolution blocking President Trump from imposing national security tariffs on Canada without explicit congressional authorization. The final count was 74 to 26. 25 Republican senators who owe their careers to Trump, senators from deep red states, senators who have backed this president through impeachments, investigations, and controversy after controversy, walked onto the Senate floor and voted with the Democrats. To understand why that number is so significant, you need to understand Senate math. A veto-proof majority requires 67 votes. They got 74. That means even if Trump vetoes this legislation, Congress can override him. The tariffs are not just paused, they are legally dead. Now, what triggered all of this? Last week, the White House announced a sweeping 25% tariff on essentially all Canadian imports: automobiles, energy, lumber, agricultural products, everything crossing that 5,500-mile border. The demand was immediate compliance on border policy, dairy trade, and energy concessions. The White House assumed Canada would do what countries usually do when America turns up the heat. They assumed Ottawa would fold. Mark Carney did not fly to Florida. He did not go on television and attack Trump. He did not send angry diplomatic cables or call emergency press conferences. What he did was far more dangerous for the White House. He went to work. For roughly 70. 2 hours before today's vote, the Canadian government was engaged in what can only be described as a surgical lobbying operation inside the United States itself. Carney's team placed calls directly to governors, senators, and business leaders in the states most economically intertwined with Canada. Not threats, not emotional appeals, data. What data? The kind that keeps American politicians awake at night. If the Canada tariffs had taken effect, assembly plants in Michigan and Tennessee were facing shutdowns within 48 hours of implementation. Gas prices across the Midwest were projected to jump by approximately 40 cents per gallon almost overnight. These aren't hypotheticals from think tanks. This is what the CEOs of major American auto manufacturers and energy companies wrote in a letter leaked just hours before the Senate vote addressed directly to Senate leadership. The language was unusually raw for corporate America. They used the phrase supply chain collapse. They said explicitly this was not a negotiating position. And here's the part that reveals the full scope of Carney's strategy. Canadian officials reportedly helped provide the underlying data that ended up in that letter. They didn't just respond to Trump's pressure. They helped arm the American business community with the ammunition to fight back on Canada's behalf from inside the United States. One photograph circulating online tells the story clearly. It shows Carney in a war room in Ottawa, surrounded by his trade team. The maps spread across the table aren't maps of Canada. They are detailed maps of U.S. congressional districts, specifically the districts most vulnerable to economic disruption from a trade war. Districts that Republicans need to hold in the midterms. Canada wasn't playing defense. They were identifying targets. When a reporter caught Carney leaving that meeting and asked whether he was concerned about Trump's response, Carney barely broke stride. He said the math worked in Canada's favor and suggested the president double-check the calculations. To understand what went wrong for the White House, you need to understand what has gone right for them in the past. Trump's entire approach to international leverage is built on a single psychological mechanism. He escalates unpredictably, creates genuine fear of economic destruction, and waits for the other side to offer concessions so he can declare victory. It worked with Mexico in the first term. It extracted token gestures from NATO partners. It has worked repeatedly because most governments, when faced with an angry American president, calculate that the cost of resistance is higher than the cost of a symbolic capitulation. Canada, under Carney, ran a completely different calculation. Instead of asking, how do we make this stop? The Carney government asked, what does America actually lose if this goes through? And the answer was devastating, not to Canada, but to American consumers, American workers, and American senators facing midterm elections in states where Canada is the primary energy supplier. Canada is the largest single source of energy imports to the United States. It is America's biggest trading partner overall, buying more American goods than China, Japan, and the United Kingdom combined. When Trump framed this as economic pressure on a dependent neighbor, he fundamentally misread the relationship. The integration runs both ways, and Carney made sure every relevant senator understood exactly which direction the pain would travel. Meanwhile, Trump's base, already dealing with elevated inflation and anxiety about jobs, wasn't rallying behind a trade war with a friendly neighbor. The optics of attacking Canada, of all countries, didn't read as strength to swing voters. It read as chaos. 25 Republican senators did the arithmetic and decided that facing Trump's anger was less dangerous than going home to explain why their constituents' grocery bills spiked. If you're watching this from Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, or anywhere in the Midwest, today's vote directly protected your finances. Lumber prices were set to rise sharply, hitting the housing market at exactly the wrong time. Fuel costs were tracking toward a significant jump. Grocery prices on products sourced from Canadian agriculture were already being modeled upward by supply chain analysts. All of that is now off the table, at least in this round. But the implications extend further than your next fill up at the pump. For decades, the United States operated on a certain assumption in global diplomacy. American economic pressure is essentially irresistible. When Washington decides to use trade as a weapon, the target eventually surrenders. Canada just disproved that assumption in broad daylight in front of the entire world. If a mid-sized allied democracy can successfully outmaneuver an American tariff offensive by building a coalition inside the US Congress itself, other governments are taking notes right now. European capitals are watching. Asian trade partners are watching. The playbook Canada just ran. Identify the American political pressure points. Supply US businesses with compelling data. Let American senators make the argument on your behalf is now a documented, proven strategy. Trump wanted to demonstrate that America under his leadership punches without consequences. Instead, the episode demonstrated that America's domestic politics can be leveraged against the White House by a sufficiently sophisticated foreign government. That is a significant shift in global dynamics. Trump will not accept this quietly. He is already publicly attacking the Republican senators who crossed him, threatening primary challenges and signaling retaliation against their state's federal projects. This is the wounded animal phase, and it is genuinely unpredictable. 3 scenarios are worth watching. The first and most likely, the White House shifts to non-tariff pressure, aggressive border inspections, slowed cargo processing, heightened scrutiny on Canadian imports through regulatory mechanisms that don't technically violate the Senate's vote. Expect friction at border crossings in the days ahead. The second scenario is a legal battle. Trump could argue that congressional authority to block presidential trade actions under national security statutes is unconstitutional. That fight would go to the Supreme Court, drag on for months, and create exactly the kind of business uncertainty that markets despise. The third scenario, the one that saves the most face and causes the least damage, would be Trump claiming the entire episode as a negotiating victory, announcing that Canada has made unspecified commitments and moving on. His social media posts today don't suggest that pivot is coming, but it remains the strategically rational exit. What's certain is that Carney's government is not celebrating. The war rooms in Ottawa remain active. The first battle is over. The larger confrontation between these two very different leaders, one impulsive and transactional, the other methodical and structural, is still very much underway. The world changed today, not with an explosion, with a Senate vote and a Canadian Prime Minister who simply refused to flinch. Do you think Congress made the right call? Did they protect the economy or undermine the presidency? And is Carney a master strategist, or is he pushing Trump towards something even more unpredictable? Drop your take in the comments. And if you want real-time coverage as this situation develops, subscribe now, because this story is moving faster than the headlines can track.